Legends in Old Nihon. In Old Nihon, the age of the sword was already long gone when the Tokugawa shogunate was implemented, back in 1604 or so. The process of the Sengoku Jidai, in fact, had been the evolution of Bushi combat from its roots, i.e. a small squad of unevenly armored irregulars protecting a pony-mounted archer, to its ultimate expression in regular military forces armed, like its European counterparts, with pike and musket, supported by decreasing numbers of veteran cavalry archers. Once the hedgehog, boar's head, and phalanx square ideas of musket and bow-supported pikemen halberdiers were accepted as the principal applicator of military force, swordsmen, no matter how impressive, haughty, and lightning quick, and sexy, were relegated to the status of ritual bodyguards, hatamoto, i.e. the daimyo's posse, bouncers in gambling halls, and other essentially superfluous employments. In point of fact, the entire period of the Tokugawa shogunate, from 1604 to 1875, was plagued by the question of what to do with all these unnecessary samurai, as, without wars to fight, the official warrior class found itself at wit's end for how to spend its time. Many displaced, leaderless, were superannuated Gojo samurai, and Bushi devolved into drink and or the deceptively abrading blandishments of the floating world, while others became enforcers for the Yakuza clans, where they quickly discovered that hemp, hashish, and opium, and the tender mercies of professional courtesans could keep the ennui and deadly boredom at bay, for a time. Duels to the death became common, although officially outlawed by the new bakufu, meaning military government, as were occasions of insulted samurai taking their swords to unarmed peasants as punishment for supposed slights to their honor, destituted by way of constant niggling decreases imposed upon their federal stipend, not to mention many and manifold addictions to the theater, to booze, drugs, and the women and men of the streets. The whole samurai class gradually realized that its time was past, that its once brilliantly polished sense of honor had been degraded by misuse into the mindless pursuit of artha, of obsession with simple gratifications. A process of assimilation then began, one in which the various samurai, scions of famous but impoverished lineages, swallowed their jagged pride and married into the families of prominent merchants, trading freedom and the bitter fruits of honor for warmth, creature comforts, and children to carry on their genetic potential. During this entire period of Tokugawa supremacy, the katana tachi, the classic samurai sword of stage, screen, myth, and legend, for all its deadly implications, was nothing more than a tool used to denote social status. To use it without permission was usually a crime punishable by imprisonment or death. Its presence at his side, thrust through his obi along with the shorter wakizashi, could, however, get a man to the head of the line at the market, theater, or house of prostitution, as long as he was the only samurai there at the time. Schools of kendo and swordplay arose, or were perpetrated during this time too, as the shogunate, with its regular armies of archers, musketeers, and pikemen yarimen, did not feel threatened by the use of the sword as art. The skills taught in these schools tended to emphasize the spiritual rather than the combat technique side of the sword, further removing the hereditary samurai bushi class from its classical underpinnings. While the Saigo and Satsuma rebellions marking the transition between the shogunate and the Restoration are often portrayed as battles between ancient dedication to traditions and a more ruthless attachment to modern efficiency, they most certainly were not. Rather, the rebels and newly armed and trained federal militias were both armed with modern weapons, including rifled muskets, brass cannon, and even a few Gatling guns. All of this notwithstanding, the sword, whether it be jian, katana, kris, rapier, claymore, or Norman Norse longsword, still dominates the warrior's dreams, carries his essence best, and will continue to do so for centuries to come. On a personal note, I love the sword, practicing with daisho, katana and wakizashi, or katana only, or no dachi on a regular basis, while attempting to understand other types as they become available for trials. Sword practice is great exercise, building and sustaining good cardiovascular, respiratory conditioning, coordination, and useful reflexes, and the sword is probably the easiest training aid to find a place for when it's not needed. If any of you out there are swordsmen, spearmen, archers, tetsubo-ben, karateka and their Chinese and Korean and Indian counterparts, or black powder enthusiasts, I should very much like to hear your thoughts on this subject. Wild Bill Cox.